New York is one of the most documented, photographed, and analyzed places on Earth. And yet it is full of places that have slipped completely from public memory. Islands nobody visits, tunnels nobody remembers, towns that were erased to make way for things that were never actually built. History here doesn't always get preserved. Sometimes it just gets paved over. These are the 18 places in New York everyone forgot even existed. Place 18, North Brother Island, East River, the Bronx. Sitting in the East River, between the Bronx and Rikers Island, is a 20-acre island the public is not allowed to visit. It is overgrown, inaccessible, and home to the crumbling remains of a quarantine hospital that held one of the most controversial figures in American public health history. New York City purchased the island in 1885 to build Riverside Hospital, a facility for patients with contagious diseases: typhoid, tuberculosis, smallpox, yellow fever. Its most famous involuntary resident was Mary Mallon, known as Typhoid Mary, the first confirmed asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. Mallon was an Irish immigrant working as a cook with no idea she was making people sick. Health officials identified her as the source of multiple outbreaks and quarantined her on North Brother Island in 1907. She was released in 1910 after agreeing not to cook again. She went back to cooking under an alias, caused another outbreak at a Manhattan hospital in 1915, and was returned to the island for the rest of her life. She died there in 1938, 26 years in total. The island had already witnessed one of New York City's worst disasters before Mallon arrived. On June 15, 1904, the steamship General Slocum caught fire in the East River nearby. More than 1,000 people, mostly women and children from a German Lutheran church on a day trip, died in the flames and the water. It remained the city's deadliest event until September 11, 2001. After World War II, the island served as veteran housing and then a treatment facility for young heroin addicts, which closed in 1963. Since then, the buildings have been left to decay. It is now a bird sanctuary. A fire broke out in one of the structures in March 2025. Almost nobody visits. Place 17, the Rochester Subway, Rochester, New York. Rochester, New York has an unusual distinction. It is the only city in the world to have built, operated, and completely abandoned a full subway system. Not partially closed, not repurposed, abandoned. The tunnels are still there. The subway was built in the bed of the old Erie Canal, which the city rerouted in 1918. Construction took 6 years and cost $12 million, double the original estimate. The subway opened on December 1, 1927, and ran for less than 30 years. At its best, it carried around 5 million riders a year. Ridership spiked during World War II gas rationing, then collapsed after the war as car ownership climbed. The city began planning expressways along the subway's own route. Sunday service was eliminated in 1952. Passenger service ended on June 30, 1956. The eastern half was demolished to make way for Interstate 490. The rest was left standing. For years, the tunnel found odd second lives. A newspaper company used part of it for newsprint delivery. Artists covered the walls with graffiti. The homeless sheltered there in winter. The city spent decades debating what to do. Fill it in, bike path, arts venue. Nothing conclusive happened. In 2010, a $17.5 million project filled in part of the Broad Street section to repair the road above. One surviving subway car, Car 60, was donated to the New York Museum of Transportation. It is the only car left from the original 12-car fleet. The smallest city ever to build a subway is also the only city to have abandoned one entirely. Place 16, Letchworth Village, Thiels, Rockland County. About 40 miles north of Manhattan, in Rockland County, sit the decaying remains of what was once described as a model institution. Letchworth Village opened in 1911 as a residential facility for people with physical and mental disabilities. The campus was designed deliberately unlike the grim Victorian asylum. Cottage-style buildings across 2,000 acres of farmland, with the stated goal of an acre for every patient. Its early reputation was genuinely good. Then came overcrowding, inadequate funding, and documented abuse. By the 1960s, more than 5,000 patients were living in facilities designed for 3,000. 70 beds were crammed into individual dormitories. Residents slept in hallways. Nurses had 30 minutes to feed entire wards. Families had, in many cases, simply dropped their relatives off and stopped visiting. In 1950, children at Letchworth were used as the first human test subjects for an experimental oral polio vaccine, a fact that would not meet any modern ethical standard for informed consent. In 1972, journalist Geraldo Rivera included Letchworth in his television expose on Willowbrook State School, bringing conditions to national attention. Letchworth closed in 1996. Large sections of the campus remain abandoned. About a mile from the main grounds, in the woods off Call Hollow Road, a cemetery holds approximately 900 graves. Most are the size of a child. Most are marked with numbers, not names. A memorial installed later reads, "Those who shall not be forgotten." Place 15, Doodletown, Bear Mountain State Park, Rockland County. The name sounds invented, but Doodletown was a functioning hamlet in the hills of Rockland County for over 200 years. By 1965, the last residents had been forced out through eminent domain, their homes demolished, the valley returned to the trees, to make room for a ski network that was never built. The name likely derives from the Dutch word doodel, meaning dead valley. The Moonsie people inhabited the area long before Europeans arrived. The first documented settler, Ithiel June, purchased 72 acres in 1762. His family would remain through multiple generations until the very end. First family in, last family out. At its peak in the 1920s, Doodletown had around 70 homes, a church that doubled as a school, small businesses, and 2 cemeteries. British soldiers marched through it before the Battle of Fort Montgomery during the Revolutionary War. General Mad Anthony Wayne used the Doodletown Road in his attack on Stony Point. It had roots in the colonial period and retained an isolated, self-sufficient character well into the 20th century. The Palisades Interstate Park Commission began acquiring Doodletown land in the 1920s as Bear Mountain was developed into a park. The last residents were pushed out in 1965. Their houses were demolished. The ski trails were never built. Today, the area consists of stone foundations, staircases that go nowhere, and 3 cemeteries, 2 of which are still active. Former residents and descendants retain the right to be buried there. The Park Service unlocks the gate on Lemon Road for funerals. People who grew up in Doodletown have returned in recent years to bring the dead home. Place 14, Bannerman Castle, Polypel Island, Hudson River. If you have ever taken the Metro North Hudson line to Poughkeepsie, you have seen it. A crumbling castle on a small rocky island in the middle of the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City. It looks like something from the Scottish Highlands, which is more or less what its builder intended. Francis Bannerman VI was born in Dundee, Scotland in 1851 and came to Brooklyn as a child. He built one of the largest military surplus businesses in American history, purchasing 90% of all U.S. Army surplus after the Spanish-American War of 1898, including 30 million ammunition cartridges that couldn't be stored within New York City limits. His son David spotted Polypel Island while canoeing on the Hudson. The family bought it in 1900. Construction of the castle-style arsenal began in 1901. Bannerman designed it himself, loosely inspired by Scottish architecture, and let contractors interpret the drawings on their own. Bannerman died in 1918. 2 years later, 200 pounds of shells and powder in the powder house exploded, damaging a large section of the complex, felt as far away as Poughkeepsie. The family continued using the island into the 1930s. The ferry boat serving the island sank in a storm in 1950. The state purchased the island in 1967. On August 8, 1969, a fire of suspected arson burned for 3 days, gutting everything inside the stone walls. The ruins are visible to every Hudson Line passenger. The Bannerman Castle Trust has offered tours since 2004. Part of the front wall collapsed in December 2009. The island keeps eroding. Place 13, the New York State Pavilion, Flushing Meadows, Queens. In 1964, New York hosted a World's Fair in Flushing Meadows Corona Park, and the centerpiece of New York State's contribution was a structure so architecturally confident it still looks futuristic. 3 observation towers connected by a sweeping oval hall with a Texaco road map of New York State embedded in its terrazzo floor. 60 years later, it still stands and has not been meaningfully used in decades. Designed by Philip Johnson, the Tent of Tomorrow featured a transparent plastic roof and a floor map measuring 166 feet by 320 feet, the largest ever produced of the state. The 3 observation towers stood 226 feet tall. The fair drew over 50 million visitors across its 2 seasons. After 1965, the pavilion entered a long decline. The plastic roof panels deteriorated and were removed in the 1970s for safety, leaving the structure open to the sky. The floor map faded and cracked. Various proposals, an ice rink, an exhibition hall, came and went without leading anywhere. The complex became a film backdrop. Men in Black shot there, so did Iron Man 3. It kept deteriorating in between. Some stabilization has been done in recent years, but the pavilion has never returned to full use. It sits in the park, enormous and skeletal, a relic of a moment when New York presented itself to the world as the city of tomorrow. Place 12, the City Hall subway station, Lower Manhattan. The original City Hall station of the New York City subway is one of the most beautiful rooms in the entire transit system. It has been closed to the public since 1945. It sits directly beneath City Hall. Its vaulted Guastavino tile ceilings, skylights, and brass chandeliers invisible to the millions of people who pass overhead every day. The station opened in 1904 as part of the very first subway line, designed by architects Hines and Lafarge as a showpiece for the new system. The curved platform, arched ceilings, and brass chandeliers were meant to signal that New York's new subway was something worth being proud of. The problem was the platform curve. City Hall Station was built on a tight bend, and as subway cars grew longer over the decades, the gap between car door and platform edge became a safety hazard. Ridership was also low. Most passengers exited at the adjacent Brooklyn Bridge station. The station closed December 31st, 1945. It still exists, entirely intact. The MTA has offered occasional tours through the New York Transit Museum. Passengers who stay on the 6 train past Brooklyn Bridge, rather than exiting, catch a glimpse of the station through the windows as the train loops around it. The glimpse lasts about 5 seconds. The chandeliers are still lit. Nobody's been allowed in for 80 years. Place 11, Grossinger's Catskill Resort Hotel, Liberty, Sullivan County. There was a time when the Catskill Mountains were the premier resort destination for Jewish families who faced discrimination at other vacation properties across the country. The region was called the Borscht Belt, and at its center was Grossinger's, a resort that grew from a small farmhouse operation in 1914 into a 1,200-acre complex with its own runway, post office, ski slope, and nightclub. Muhammad Ali trained there. Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds honeymooned there. Jenny Grossinger, who ran the resort through its best decades, built it into something more than a hotel. It was a community, an institution, a place guests returned to year after year. At its peak in the 1950s and 1960s, Grossinger's was one of the most famous resorts in the country. The decline came gradually, as discrimination faded elsewhere, as interstate highways made Florida accessible, and as tastes shifted, the Catskill resorts lost their specific reason to exist. Grossinger's closed in 1986. The buildings were left standing. For decades, the complex sat vacant through Catskill winters. The hotel, the pool, the nightclub, the skating rink, all left to deteriorate, stripped by weather and vandals. The resort that had hosted championship boxing matches was abandoned without ceremony. A developer has been working on the site in recent years, but for most of the time since 1986, Grossinger's was simply a large, rotting reminder of a very specific chapter in American social history. Place 10. The Smallpox Hospital Ruins, Roosevelt Island, Manhattan. On the southern tip of Roosevelt Island, visible from both the Manhattan and Queens shorelines, sit the ruins of the Renwick Smallpox Hospital. Gothic stone walls, empty window frames, ivy climbing the facade, a roofless shell framed against the Manhattan skyline. In 1976, it became the only ruin in New York City to receive official landmark status. The hospital was built in 1856, designed by James Renwick Jr., the same architect behind St. Patrick's Cathedral and Grace Church. It served as a quarantine facility for smallpox patients at a time when the disease moved regularly through the crowded tenements of Lower Manhattan. The Gothic Revival design was chosen not for drama, but for ventilation. The open stonework promoted airflow in an era before germ theory had fully transformed medical thinking. The building was briefly used as a nurse's residence in the early 20th century, then abandoned. The roof collapsed. The floors gave way. The stone walls survived decades of neglect and earned landmark protection in the process. Today, the ruin is illuminated at night as part of the Four Freedoms Park development on the southern tip of the island. Visitors can walk directly up to it. Most people heading to the park or the aerial tram glance at it and keep moving. Few know it is the oldest surviving building on Roosevelt Island, built before the Civil War. Place 9. Kings Park Psychiatric Center, Kings Park, Long Island. Built in the 1880s on Long Island's North Shore, Kings Park Psychiatric Center was once among the largest psychiatric facilities in the United States. At its peak in the 1950s, it housed over 9,000 patients across 800 acres. Building 93, the main patient tower, rose 13 stories and could hold over 3,000 patients by itself. The history follows the familiar institutional arc: reform-minded origins, steady overcrowding, inadequate funding, documented abuse, closure as deinstitutionalization shifted policy toward community care. Kings Park began closing wards through the 1970s and 1980s and officially shut in 1996. What it left behind is enormous. Building 93 still stands. 13 stories of broken windows, collapsed ceilings, and graffiti-covered corridors rising over the Long Island landscape. The grounds became Nissequogue River State Park in 1999, making the exterior publicly accessible while keeping the buildings themselves off-limits. Film crews use the buildings for horror productions, which is an understandable choice. Various redevelopment proposals have been floated over the years. None have advanced in any serious way. Building 93 keeps deteriorating in plain sight, on public land, in a park where families walk dogs and watch the sound on clear days. Nobody seems to know what to do with a 13-story ruin that belongs to everyone and serves no one. Place 8. Tahawus, Essex County, Adirondacks. Deep in the Adirondack Mountains, in one of the most remote corners of the northeastern United States, there is a ghost town called Tahawus. It was built to serve industrial operations, an iron furnace in the 1820s, then a titanium mining company in the 20th century. And when those operations ended, the buildings and machinery were left where they stood. The McIntyre Ironworks began production around 1827, but the ore was contaminated with a mineral that made the iron unworkable. The works failed. That same ore body, it turned out, contained one of the largest deposits of ilmenite, a titanium ore, in North America. The National Lead Company began mining it in the 1940s, building a company town of several hundred residents to support operations. Titanium mining eventually wound down as well. The town was abandoned. What remains includes stone structures from the Iron Works era, the ruins of the blast furnace, 20th century residential buildings, and rusting industrial machinery being reclaimed by the forest. There is also a specific footnote. In September 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was hiking near Tahawus when he received word that President McKinley had been shot and was not expected to survive. Roosevelt made an overnight dash down the mountain by wagon to reach a train, traveled to Buffalo, and was sworn in as president. A trail marker records the spot where the message reached him. Place 7, Camp Hero, Montauk, Long Island. At the eastern tip of Long Island, a former military base sits on a bluff above the Atlantic with its radar tower still visible for miles. Camp Hero was built in the 1940s as a coastal defense installation to protect New York Harbor from potential German naval attack. The guns were never fired in combat. The base was decommissioned in 1984 and became a state park. The AN/FPS-35 radar tower, one of the largest ever built for military use, still stands over the landscape. It has not been operational since the base closed, but it is unmistakable and large enough to be seen from the beach and the road with equal clarity. The site is more famous in some circles for what allegedly happened after the base closed than for what actually happened while it was open. The Montauk Project, a set of claims involving secret government experiments in time travel and mind control conducted beneath the facility, has circulated since the 1980s. None of it has been corroborated by any credible evidence. The writers of Stranger Things acknowledged drawing on Montauk mythology when developing their story, which was originally set in Montauk before being relocated to the fictional Hawkins, Indiana. The park is open to the public for hiking and fishing. The radar tower will probably keep feeding the theories indefinitely. Place 6, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, Lower East Side, Manhattan. On a side street in the Lower East Side stands a synagogue built in 1887 that was, at its construction, one of the most ambitious Jewish houses of worship in the United States. Eastern European Jewish immigrants who had arrived with limited resources built it with a facade that combines Moorish, Gothic, and Romanesque details in a configuration unlike anything else in the neighborhood. For several decades, the synagogue anchored a neighborhood that was the center of Jewish immigrant life in America. The Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century was among the most densely populated areas on Earth, packed with families from Russia, Poland, Romania, and Eastern Europe. As the Jewish population moved to Brooklyn, Queens, and the suburbs through the mid-20th century, the congregation shrank. By the 1950s, the main sanctuary had been shuttered. Services continued in a small ground-floor chapel, while the grand hall above was left to deteriorate. In 1986, preservationists formed the Eldridge Street Project and began a restoration that took 20 years to complete. The synagogue reopened in 2007 as the Museum at Eldridge Street. The main sanctuary, with its original woodwork, plaster ceiling, and a contemporary rose window by artist Kiki Smith, is now accessible to the public. It is one of the more remarkable survival stories in the city. A building that was within decades of collapse and is now fully restored, still standing on the same block where it was built. Place 5, the Burden Iron Works, Troy, New York. In the mid-19th century, the Burden Iron Works in Troy, New York was one of the most productive industrial operations in the world. Henry Burden's factory produced horseshoes at a rate made possible by his own patented machinery, 60 horseshoes per minute. During the Civil War, the factory supplied horseshoes to the Union Army on a scale that directly supported its logistics in the field. The centerpiece of the operation was the Burden wheel, a water wheel measuring 60 feet in diameter and 22 feet wide, completed in the 1850s. When built, it was the largest water wheel in the Western Hemisphere, generating power for the entire factory from the flow of Wenanskill Creek. Burden died in 1871. Competition from Pittsburgh steelmakers and the shift from horse-drawn to rail transport eroded the business. The factory closed in the early 20th century. The burden wheel eventually collapsed. What remains today, the stone building that housed the wheel, other structures along Water Street in Troy, is largely unrecognized, even by people who live nearby. The Hudson Mohawk Industrial Gateway has worked to document the site, and some preservation efforts have been made over the years. But the factory that once shod the horses of the Union Army has been mostly forgotten by the city that built it and by the country whose military it served. Place 4. Halcyon Hall, Millbrook, New York. In the Dutchess County town of Millbrook, a large Victorian structure sat on a hillside for over a century before being demolished in 2022. Halcyon Hall was built in 1893 as a resort hotel. The hotel failed. The property eventually became the Bennett School for Girls, a boarding school that operated from 1907 until 1978, when it closed after losing students to co-educational alternatives. After the school closed, the buildings were left standing. Halcyon Hall, turreted, sprawling, a combination of Victorian resort ambition and institutional additions accumulated over decades, became one of the most photographed abandoned structures in New York State. Urban explorers documented old furniture still in classrooms, equipment abandoned mid-use, rooms full of the accumulated evidence of a school that had simply stopped one day and never been cleaned out. It attracted photographers from across the region for years. The 2022 demolition was watched by many who had followed its deterioration. Some considered it a significant loss. Others considered it inevitable. What remained was cleared land, some outlying buildings, and photographs, which, in the case of places like this, is often the only form of survival that's available. Place 3. The Women's Rights Convention site. Seneca Falls, New York. Seneca Falls is not forgotten in the way most places on this list are forgotten. It has a national historical park and regular visitors. It belongs here because the actual weight of what happened there in July 1848 is still somehow underestimated relative to its significance. The Seneca Falls Convention, held July 19th and 20th, 1848, was the first women's rights convention in United States history. Organized primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, it produced the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men and women are created equal and that women were entitled to vote. This was 72 years before the 19th Amendment. Frederick Douglass attended and spoke in support of women's suffrage. About 300 people were present. Roughly 100 signed the declaration. The Wesleyan Methodist Chapel where it was held spent portions of the 20th century as a movie theater, a laundromat, and a post office, repurposed for whatever the town needed, without particular attention to what had taken place inside it. It is now part of the Women's Rights National Historical Park. The fact that it served as a laundromat for a stretch of the 20th century is worth sitting with for a moment. Place 2. Andong House, Ridgewood, Queens. On a corner in Ridgewood, Queens, stands a farmhouse built around 1709, considered the oldest surviving structure in New York City. The Van der Ende Andong House predates the American Revolution by nearly 70 years and predates the Brooklyn Bridge by over a century and a half. It has been in the same spot while the entire city grew up around it. The house was built by Paulus van der Ende, a Dutch farmer, on land in what was then rural western Long Island. The Andong family acquired it in the 1780s and held it for generations. Local fieldstone and brick construction has proven more durable than virtually anything else built in the 5 boroughs during the same period. The Greater Ridgewood Historical Society now preserves and interprets the site. It is open to visitors on a limited schedule. Most people in Queens, let alone anywhere else, have never heard of it, which is a predictable response to a farmhouse sitting unobtrusively in a residential neighborhood without drawing attention to itself. It does not look like a landmark. It looks like an old house, which is exactly what it is. The oldest surviving one in New York City, built when the city surrounding it on all sides did not yet exist. Place 1. Doodletown Cemetery, Bear Mountain State Park, Rockland County. Doodletown appeared earlier on this list, but the cemetery deserves its own entry because it operates differently from every other place here. Most forgotten places stop. This one has not. When the last residents of Doodletown were evicted in 1965, they retained one right the state could not easily remove: the right to be buried in their hometown's cemeteries. 2 of Doodletown's 3 cemeteries remain active to this day. Former residents and their descendants can still choose to be interred there, and some do. The Park Service maintains a locked gate on Lemon Road that it opens for funerals. A procession makes its way up the overgrown hill, past foundations where houses used to stand, through trees that have reclaimed the old streets. The graves span from the colonial period to recent years. There are people alive today who were born in Doodletown and intend to be buried there, in a valley that officially stopped existing 60 years ago. It is the only ghost town in New York, possibly one of the only ghost towns anywhere, where the graveyard is still growing. The living stopped coming in 1965. The dead never stopped. New York keeps building forward, which means it is always leaving something behind. An island nobody can visit. A tunnel beneath a city that forgot it existed. A farmhouse that has outlasted everything around it. A cemetery where people still bring their dead to a town that no longer exists. The places on this list are not connected by any single thread, except that they existed, they mattered to someone, and then they were left behind. If this video was worth your time, hit like. It helps more people find it. And subscribe if you want to keep exploring the forgotten corners of history. There's no shortage of them.